Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne. Chapter 11, in which Phileas Fogg buys a conveyance at a fabulous price. The train had started to time. It carried a certain number of travellers, some officers, some civil officials, and some optimum and indigo merchants, whose business was to call them to the eastern part of the peninsula. Passepartout occupied the same compartment as his master. A third traveller was in the opposite corner. It was Brigadier General Sir Francis Cromarty, one of the partners of Mr. Fogg during the trip from Suez and Bombay, who was rejoining his troops stationed near Benar. Sir Francis Cromarty, tall, fair, and about 50 years old, who had distinguished himself highly during the last revolt of the Sepoys, had truly deserved to be called a native. From the youth he had lived in India, and only well been occasioned in the country of his birth. He was a well-posted man who had been glad to give information as to the manners, the history, and organization of the Indian country. If Phileas Fogg had been the man to ask for such things, but this gentleman was not for asking anything. He was not travelling, he was described as a circumference. He was a heavy body traversing an orbit around a terrestrial globe. According to the laws of the rational mechanics, at this moment he was going over in his mind the calculation of the hours consumed since his departure from London, and he would have rubbed his hands if it had been his nature to make useless moves. Sir Francis Cromarty had recognized the originality of his travelling companion, although he had only studied him with his cards in hand between two rubbers, and he was ready to ask whether a human heart beat this cold exterior, whether Phileas Fogg had his soul alive to the beauties of the nature and to moral aspirations. This was a question to him. Of all the oddities the General had just met, there were none to be compared to this project of the exact sciences. Phileas Fogg had not kept secret from Sir Francis Cromarty his plan of a tour around the world, nor conditions under which he saw carrying it out. The General saw this bet only as an eccentricity without a useful aim, in which he was wanting necessarily to the transire benefacio which was to guide every reasonable man. In the same manner in which this singular gentleman was moving on, he would evidently be doing nothing, either for himself or for others. An hour after having left Bombay, the train crossing the viaducts had left behind an island Salkhead and reached the mainland. At the station of Kalyan, it left to the right the branch of which via Kandal and Pune descends towards the southeast India and reaches the station Panvel. At this point it became entangled in the defiles of the western Ghat mountains, with the bases of traps and basalt, whose highest summits are covered in thick wood. From time to time Sir Francis Cromarty and Phileas Fogg exchanged a few words, and at this moment the General, having recommencing a conversation which frequently lagged, said, "A few years ago, Mr. Fogg, you would have experienced up to this point a delay which would probably interrupt your journey." "Why so, Sir Francis?" "Because the railway stopped at the base of the mountains, which was to cross the palanquin or on a pony's back as the station of Kandal, or the opposite slope. That delay would not have deranged my programme," replied Mr. Fogg. "I would have seen the probability of certain obstacles." "But, Mr. Fogg," replied the General, "you are in danger of having bad business on your hands with this young man's adventure." Passepartout, with his feet wrapped up in his cloak, was sleeping soundly, and did not dream that they were talking about him. "The British government is extremely severe, and rightly, for this kind of trespass," replied Sir Francis Cromarty. "It insists, above all things, that religious customs of Hindus shall be respected, and if your servant had been taken—" "Yes, if he had been taken, Sir Francis," replied Mr. Fogg, "he would have been sentenced, and he would have undergone his punishment, then he would have quietly returned to Europe. I do not see how this matter must delay his master." Thereupon the conversation stopped again, and during the night the train crossed the Ghauts, passed on to Nax, and next day, the 21st of October, it was hurrying towards a relatively flat country, formed by the territory. The territory was well the country, well cultivated, was strewn with small villages, above which minaret a pagoda took place on the steeple of the European church. Numerous small streams, principally tributaries of the god Every, irrigated this fertile country. Passepartout, having waked up, looked around, and could not believe that he was crossing the countries of Hindus in a train of the great peninsular railway. It appeared improbable to him, yet there was nothing more real. Locomotive, guided by the arm of an English engineer heated with English coal, was puffing out its smoke over the plantations of cotton trees, coffee, nutmeg, and red pepper. The steam twisted itself into spirals, and about the group of palms between which appeared the picturesque bungalows of a few vihars, a sort of abandoned monastery, and wonderful temples enriched with inexhaustible ornaments of Indian architecture. Then immense reaches of country straight stretched out of sight, jungles in which were not wanting snakes and tigers whom the noise of the train did not frighten, and finally forest cuts through by the route of the world. And still the haunt of elephants, which was, to the pensive eye, looked at the train as it passed so rapidly. During the morning, beyond the station of Malagom, the travellers traversed that fatal territory, which was so drenched by blood, the secretaries of the goddess Kali. Not far off, there rose Ellora and its splendid pagodas, in the celebrated Aurungabad, in the capital of the ferocious Aurangzeb. Now simply the principal place of one of the provinces had detached from the kingdom of Nizam. It was all over this country that Faranghe, the chief of thugs and the king of stranglers, had exercised his dominion, and these assassins, united in the association, could not have been reached, strangled in honor of the goddess of death, victims of every age, without ever shedding blood. There was time when the ground could not be dug up anywhere in this neighborhood without finding a corpse. The rich government had been able, in great part, to prevent these murders, but the horrible organization exists yet, and carries on its operations. 12:30, the train stopped at the station of Burhanpur, and Passepartout was able to obtain gold, a pair of Indian slippers, ornamented with false pearls, which he put on in evident show of vanity. The travellers took a hasty breakfast, and started again for Asagar, having for a moment stopped upon the shore of Tapati, a small river emptying into the Gulf of Cambay near Surat. It is opportune to mention that the thoughts of which Passepartout was busied until his arrival at Bombay, he thought that matters would not go that far, no far, but that now that he is hurrying at full speed across India, his mind had gone under a change. His natural feelings came back to him in a rush. He felt again the fancied ideas of youth. He took seriously his master's plans, and believed that in reality of the bet. Consequently, this tour of the world, and indeed in this maximum of time which could not be exceeded, he had already disturbed at a possible delay in the accidents which might occur upon the route, and he felt interested in the wager, and trembled at the thought that he might have to compromise in the evening by his unpardonable foolishness, so that the much phlegmatic within Mr. Fogg, he was much more uneasy. He counted and recounted the days that had passed, cursed at the stopping of the train, accused of his slowness, blamed Mr. Fogg and Peto for having promised a reward for the engineer. A good fellow did not always know what was possible upon a steamer which was not a railway train, whose speed is regulated. Towards the evening they entered the defiles of the mountain of Sudapur, which separated the territory of Candish from that of Bundelkund. The next day, of 22nd of October, Passepartout, having consulted his watch, replied to a question of Sir Francis Cromarty that was 3 o'clock in the morning. In fact, this famous watch, always regulated by the meridian of Greenwich, is nearly 77 degrees west, and ought to be, was 4 hours slow. Sir Francis corrected the hour given by Passepartout, added the same remark that the latter had already heard from Fix, and was trying to make him understand that he ought to regulate his watch on each new meridian; that since He was constantly going towards the east, that is, in the face of the sun. The days were growing shorter by as many times as 4 minutes as he had crossed the degrees. It was useless. Whether the stubborn fellow had understood the remarks of the general or not, he had persisted the putting his watch ahead, and he kept always the London time. An innocent madness at any rate, which could hurt no one. At 8 o'clock in the morning, 15 miles before they reached Rothal, the train stopped in the midst of an immense opening, and on the edge of which the bungalows and workmen's hut. The conductor of the train had passed out cars calling out, "The passengers will get out here." Phileas Fogg looked at Sir Francis Cromarty, who appeared not to understand this stop in the midst of a forest and tamarines and arcades. This stop. Passepartout, not less surprised, rushed onto the track and returned almost immediately. "Eh, Monsieur, no more railway. What do you mean?" said Sir Francis Cromarty. "I mean that the train goes no further." The brigadier general immediately got out of the car. Phileas Fogg, in no hurry, followed him. Both spoke to the conductor. "Where are we?" In the hamlet of Colby," replied the doctor. "We'll stop here?" "Without a doubt. The railway is not finished." "How? It's not finished?" "No, there is a section of 50 miles to construct between this point and Allahabad, where the track commences again. But the papers have announced this opening of the entire line." "Well, but generally the papers were mistaken." "And you give tickets from Bombay to Calcutta," replied Sir Francis, who was beginning to get excited. "Of course, but travellers know very well that they have to be otherwise transported from Colby to Alaba." Sir Francis was furious. Passepartout would have been willingly knocked the conductor down, who had not helped himself, and he did not dare look at his master. Sir Francis said simply, "We will go, and if you will be kind enough to see about some way of reaching Allahabad." "Mr. Fogg, this is a day absolutely prejudicial to your interests." "No, Sir Francis, it was provided for." "What do you mean?" "Did you know that the railway that by no means, but I knew that some obstacle or other would occur sooner or later upon my route. Now nothing is interfered with. I have gained 2 days, and I can afford to lose. The steamer of Calcutta to Hong Kong at noon on the 25th. This is only 23rd. We shall arrive at Calcutta in time. There is nothing to be said in reply to such complete certainty. Only it was too true that the finished portion of the railway stopped at this point. In the newspapers are certain watches which are getting mania getting ahead of time, and they had announced the finishing of the line prematurely. And most of the passengers knew of this break in the line. Descending from the train, they examined the vehicles of all sorts in villages: four-wheeled packalies, cars drawn by zebuses, a sort of ox with humps. Travelling cars resembled walking pagodas, palanquins, ponies. Mr. Fogg and Sir Francis Cromarty, having hunted through the entire village, returned without found anything. "I shall go on foot," said Mr. Fox. Passepartout, who had rejoined their master, said with significant grimace, looking down at his magnificent but delicate slippers. "Very fortunate," he said. He had also been hunting for something, and hesitating a little, he said, "Monsieur, I believe I have found a means of conveyance." "What?" "An elephant belonging to an Indian lives 100 steps from here." "Let's go see the elephant," replied Mr. Fogg. 5 minutes later, Phileas Fogg, Sir Francis Cromarty, and Passepartout arrived at a hut which was against an enclosure of high palisades. In the hut there was an Indian, and looked enclosure an elephant. Upon their demand, the Indian took Mr. Fogg and the two companions into the enclosure. They found there a half-tamed animal, in which its owner was not raising, not to hire out, but a beast of combat, and this was and had not commenced to modify the natural mild character of an animal in the manner to lead him gradually to that paroxysm of rage called mush in Hindu language, in that feeding him for 3 months with sugar and butter. This treatment may not be proper to attain such result, but is none the less employed with success by their keepers. And Keone, the animal's name, could, like all his fellows, rapidly go rapidly on a long march. In default of the other conveyances, Phileas Fogg determined to employ him, but the elephants are very expensive in India, which are beginning to get scarce. The males, which are loaned to fit for circus feats, are very much sought for. These animals are rarely reproduced when they are reduced to the tame state, that they cannot obtain by only by hunting. So that the object of extreme care, when Mr. Fogg asked the Indian if he would hire him, his elephant flatly refused. Mr. Fogg persisted, and offered an excessive price for the animal, £10 per hour. Refused. £20 still refused. £40 refused again. Passepartout jumped at every advance in the price, but the Indian would never not be tempted. The sum was a handsome one, however. The elephant was to be employed for 15 hours to reach Allahabad. It was £600 earned for his owner. Phileas Fogg, without all being excited, then proposed the Indian to buy his animal, offered him first £1,000. And the Indian would not sell, and perhaps the rogue scented a large transaction. Sir Francis Cromarty took Fogg aside, and begged him to reflect before going further. Phileas Fogg, having replied to a companion that he was not in the habit of acting without reflection, that was a bet of £20,000 was at stake, and this elephant was necessary to him, and that he should pay 20 times his value, he would have his elephant. Phileas Fogg went again for the Indian, whose small eyes, lit up with greed, showed that it was only a question of price. Phileas Fogg offered successively 1,200, 1,500, 1,800, and finally £2,000. Passepartout, so rosy ordinarily, was pale with emotion. At £2,000 the Indian gave up. "By my slippers," replied Passepartout, "here is a magnificent price for elephant meat." The business concluded, that all was necessary to find a guide. That was easier. A young Parsee, with an intelligent face, offered his services. Mr. Fogg accepted him, and offered him a large reward to sharpen his wits. The elephant was brought out and equipped without delay. The Parsee understood perfectly the business of mahout, or elephant driver. He covered the sort of saddle-cloth on the back of the elephant, and put each flank two kinds of rather uncomfortable howdahs. Phileas Fogg paid the Indian the banknotes taken from the famous carpet-bag. It seemed that they were as if they were taken from Passepartout's very vitals. But then Mr. Fogg offered to Sir Francis Cromarty to convey him to Allahabad. The general accepted, and one passenger was not more than enough to tire this enormous animal. Some provisions were bought at Colby. Sir Francis Cromarty took a seat in one of the howdahs, and Phileas Fogg in the other. Passepartout got astride the animal, and between his master and the brigadier general, and the Parsee perched upon the elephant's neck, and at 9 o'clock the animal, leaving the village, penetrated the thick forest of palm trees.